talk about section 2 today. I think I uploaded this chapter to GC already. But most of these concepts are pretty easy and intuitive, like you can kind of figure them out just by common sense, I guess. So the last time that I talked to you guys, it feels like it's been a month. But I mentioned about how the environment is divided into a hierarchy of different levels, starting with the biosphere, which is the most inclusive. And then the biosphere is made of ecosystems, which are made of communities, which are made of populations, which are made of organisms. So now we're going to go into some specific questions about an organism, like where does it live? Why does it live there? And so the answers to these questions are complex and involve not only the evolution of that organism, it also includes their tolerances, like what kind of temperatures they can tolerate, or just any kind of aspect of the environment, really. The history and conditions of their habitats, and a lot of other factors. So we're going to start looking into those aspects today. So the first thing that I want to mention is on the level of ecosystem. I said that an ecosystem includes both the living and non-living parts of the environment. So now we can assign vocabulary to that. The living parts of the environment are the biotic factors. And so we have to look at all the living things that can affect an organism, whether it's a predator-prey relationship, or a parasite kind of situation, or just competition with other kinds of species or other individuals. We have to look at all the living things that affect the life of an organism. The physical and chemical characteristics that are non-living are called abiotic. And in biology, one of the easiest ways of learning vocabulary is to break it down, because usually vocabulary is based on Latin roots and meanings. So first we take the prefix a, means not or without, and bio means life. So if you just look at the word biology, logi comes from logos, which means knowledge of. And of course, this is life. So it's the knowledge of life, or the study of life is how we kind of translate that now. And the suffix ic just means that it's an adjective. So the term abiotic is referring to the factors. And so the factors that are not life or without life. So that's abiotic. And I'll try to help point out the meanings of words, the vocabulary words, as we go. So abiotic factors can include temperature, humidity, pH, salinity, which is the amount of salt, oxygen, sunlight, nitrogen if you're plants, precipitation. All of these kinds of things are non-living factors that affect living things in the environment. And of course, both biotic and abiotic factors depend on each other, which is one of those themes in ecology, which is interdependence. So not only are living things all connected together and we depend on each other, but also the abiotic factors are also dependent on the living things, and living things are dependent on the abiotic factors. You might think, how are abiotic factors dependent on living things? Well, one of the things is nitrogen. Now, nitrogen is a nutrient that is required by all living things to make proteins, but we can't do anything, excuse me. We can't do anything with the nitrogen in the air, right? Because air is about 80% nitrogen, 20% oxygen. It's for like 79, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But this version of nitrogen is unusable by living things. So how do we get nitrogen? We get it from plants. How do plants get it? They have bacteria that live on their roots, and the bacteria is able to convert nitrogen from the atmosphere into usable nitrogen. But anyway, the point was, how does nitrogen depend on living things? So one of the other themes in ecology is recycling. Nutrients are recycled. So if you think about how nitrogen is replaced, so like the plants get nitrogen and they absorb it from the soil, and then we eat the plants, so we get nitrogen that way. And then how do we return it to the soil? Well, two methods. When we pee, when we urinate, a main component of the waste product that's in urine is urea, which is a nitrogen product. So when animals urinate, they return nitrogen to the soil, but a big part of how we recycle nutrients back to the soil is when we die. And I don't mean, like, when I say we, I mean living things, not just humans, because of course humans, we like to put ourselves in coffins and bury us in the ground, or to cremate us and keep us in an urn for all of eternity. That's not really recycling, but let's just pretend like we're animals in nature. When an animal or an organism dies in nature, it just dies wherever it dies, and it decomposes, and those nutrients are all broken down and returned to the soil. So this is a way that the abiotic factors depend on biotic factors in the environment. Now, of course, abiotic factors are not constant. Not only do they vary from place to place, as you can see from these three pictures, we have the rainforest, we have, this is called the taiga. This is basically just underneath the North Pole. It forms kind of a belt around the North Pole. When you go a little bit further south, when the ground is not frozen, you can have trees growing there. And then, of course, the desert. So from place to place, the geographical location can determine abiotic factors, but it also varies over time. So this is obviously in winter, and in the summer, it won't look like that. So from seasons over time, even if you look at, because of global warming, we see a lot of these forest fires that are occurring a lot more frequently. I know that a couple of weeks ago, there was flooding in China. I don't remember which city it was, but there was like videos of people that were in a subway that were like waist deep in water, being stuck from massive flooding. There was also flooding around the same time in Arizona in the US, which is like almost unheard of because it's in desert area, but they had like flash floods where you've got like a whole bunch of rain that's dumped on one area in a very short time, and it causes this like spontaneous flooding. So I saw a video on Twitter, which was literally like this, it looked like a river going down the middle of this street, like with houses. And it was just like this car was floating down the street. It was really weird. That was in Arizona. And of course, California is super famous for its wildfires. Turkey was on fire last week, I think, the country of Turkey. So weather is obviously changing as well because of the global change that's happening. So if the environment's always changing from place to place, time to time, whether it's global warming, whether it's getting more severe, whatever, organisms have to be able to either deal with those changing conditions, or they have to figure out a way to leave. So most organisms can live with a wide range of environmental conditions. We have some bacteria that can live far below the surface at temperatures as high as 110 degrees Celsius, where water boils. We also have plants that can live in the North and South Pole, where it can become minus 70 degrees. But where you find organisms that can live in these extreme environments, you usually find that they are adapted for that specific extreme. You won't find a plant that can survive both negative 70 and 110. So usually, and these are obviously extremes, usually organisms can withstand like somewhere in the middle kind of thing, you know what I mean? So the first thing that we look at is a tolerance curve. Now, the word tolerance just in general means to be able to withstand, to be able to live under those conditions. And we have what's called a bell curve, because it's shaped like a bell, where normally most species are going to have an optimal range where they perform the best that is somewhere in the middle. So the optimum range for this particular environmental factor, on the x-axis, you're going to have your abiotic factor. Let's say it's temperature, right? So this is hot and this is cold. And the y-axis is basically going to be performance. So do you perform well at hot temperatures or cold temperatures or somewhere in the middle? So you can see you've got the optimal range where optimal means the best. You'll find most of the members of the species that live in this optimal range, and very few species are going to live here. You've got a zone of stress where it's difficult, but not impossible. And of course, you've got the same thing at the other end. And then you have at the extreme ends, you've got intolerance where you find no species because they cannot, literally, they cannot survive at those extremes. So there's always an optimal range, and it really depends on the individual species. It depends on the abiotic factor that you're looking at. For example, let me just go back here for a second, if I can find it. There we go, blank slide. So let's take anteaters. You know what anteater is? An anteater. It's let me find a picture. Anteater. Hold on a sec. Oh, I don't want that. Where's the, there we go. These guys. Okay, so this is an animal called an anteater. And this is an example here. You can see the tongue. They've got really long snout or nose and a really long tongue. You can see if you do better here. So the tongue can be as long as almost a meter. Now, there's a reason for that. And that species is specifically adapted for having a tongue that long because of its speciality, what it eats. So if you look at tongue length, oops, if I can spell, tongue length. So this is long and this is short. You're not going to find a bell curve that's in the middle, because for an anteater, it's not an advantage to have a medium length tongue. So you're not going to find that. What you are going to find is that most of the species are going to fall into the long tongue range. Why this is because anteaters, they have really, really long claws. And you can look at Google images if you want. Really long claws, very sharp, because obviously they eat ants. That's why they're called anteaters. And so what they do is they use their claws to go into like dead or rotting wood, and they peel the wood back, and they get access to the ants that live in trees. They can also dig inside of an ant hill, and then they stick their long nose inside of that, and then their really long, like 2-foot long tongue comes out, and it's sticky, and it kind of like does like a helicopter like whirligig thing, and the ants stick to the tongue. So the longer the tongue is, the more ants that can stick to it. So that's an advantage for the anteater. So you can find, like I said, depending on the organism and depending on which abiotic factor you're looking at, you can find tolerance curves in the middle, which is where most of them are, but sometimes you can find tolerance curves that favor either one extreme or the other, and sometimes both. So if the environment's changing and if organisms have a tolerance curve, what can organisms do if the environment changes? There's options. The first option is called acclimation. Now, acclimation, I call getting used to it. And if you've ever had a fish tank and you buy new fish, they usually recommend that you take the bag that you get from the fish store and you put the whole bag with the fish inside your fish tank. What this does is allow acclimation between the water from the fish tank at the store and the water that's in your tank at home, because obviously they're not going to be the same. Not only are they not the same temperature, but you probably don't use the same chemicals to treat the water. You could have different minerals or different amounts of oxygen in the water, etc. So what happens if you buy new goldfish and you take it home and you just dump the goldfish straight into your tank at home is that it's possible that you will shock the fish and they will die. So another example of acclimation, I can speak from personally, which is when I first moved to Thailand. I moved here from the Midwest, which has like all 4 seasons. We have fall and winters and springs and summers. And when I first moved to Thailand, it was April. And for the first few months I was here, I really thought like, oh, dear God, I'm never going to get used to this heat. Like I can't be outside for longer than like 10 minutes. I feel like I'm going to die. It's like suffocating. But after 18 years, I am acclimated. Like, sure, yeah, it's hot, but like it's not nearly as bad as it was in the beginning. The same thing if you ever go to a colder climate and you stay there for a period of time. In the beginning, you think you're going to die because it's so cold, but after a while, you acclimate. And funny story, after I was here for about, was it about a year and a half? Yeah, a year and a half. I went back to visit my family during Christmas. And at that time in Chicago, it was, I think it was -10 Celsius, but it felt like -30 because Chicago is very windy. And I went outside and like literally all the hairs in your nose like freeze and it's hard to breathe. And I was like, no, I don't want to go outside. So I have actually acclimated to the Thailand weather, and being back in the cold is actually very, very, very horrible. I don't like it at all. So acclimation. Okay. Now, the way that organisms deal with the environment depends on how they control their internal conditions. And I know that you are familiar with these 2 types, but we're going to call them something different. So first we have conformers. These, they're called conformers because the word conform, the word conform means to match. So when you go to school in person and you have to put on a uniform, you are conforming, you are matching everyone else by wearing the same uniform. Conformers do not regulate their internal conditions. What you probably grew up being taught was that these are cold-blooded animals. Then we have the regulators. The word regulate means to control. Right? You can regulate the temperature in your house with your air con, and regulators use energy to control their internal conditions. These are called warm-blooded. And so when you think about what kinds of animals are conformers and regulators, obviously this only applies to animals because it has to deal with how they expend their energy, and because they have circulation. Plants don't have circulation, so they don't have to control their conditions. We've got fish, amphibians, amphibians, there was an I there. Amphibians and reptiles are all conformers. And then you've got birds and mammals are regulators. And if you think about just a very general difference between birds and mammals versus fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds have feathers, mammals have hair. This is one of the adaptations that regulators have to help them control. Sorry, the green's kind of hard to see on top of the blue. To control. So we need to have adaptations that help us control conditions inside, mainly temperature, right? So having hair is one of those ways to help us. So when we get cold, the hair stands up. I'm sure you've had goosebumps where you feel the hair stand up. And the reason why hair stands up is because then it traps air next to the skin, and your body temperature keeps that air warm. So you're kind of almost putting an invisible jacket on. But the main way that we control internal conditions is that we eat. We need tons of energy. I mean, like tons of energy. That's why birds and mammals have to eat several times per day, to maintain the energy needed to keep our bodies warm, whereas conformers do not need that energy. They don't spend any energy. So if it's cold outside, their body is cold. If it's warm outside, their body is warm. So that makes their optimal range narrower. They cannot live in a large range of temperatures because too hot, they'll die. Too cold, they'll die. Whereas birds and mammals, they have adaptations to help them control their internal temperature. So if it's hot outside, 37, cold outside, 37. So we can live in a lot larger or wider range of temperatures. You might have an anaconda or a python eat, if it eats something large, like say an anaconda eats a deer, that might be its only meal for the whole year. Whereas say a hummingbird is really small and very active. It has to eat every hour or it'll die. Can you even imagine? So this is an illustration of warm-blooded animals or regulators. You see when it's cold outside, body temperature is the same. Hot outside, body temperature is the same. Compared to conformers, if it's cold outside, they're cold. If it's hot outside, they're hot. This is going to control where on Earth organisms can live. This is why you don't find frogs in the North Pole. This is why you don't find polar bears in the jungle. I really love this picture. This is a thermo imaging of, it looks like some kind of gecko, I guess, some kind of reptile on a human being. This scale is in Fahrenheit, by the way. It's not 90 degrees Celsius. But you can see how warm his body is compared to the lizard, okay? But if the lizard stays on his body, it will start to warm up. They actually have video that you can see. I'll see if I can find it for tomorrow. But there's videos of, specifically, I saw one on Discovery, I think, of a marine iguana. So these are iguanas that live along the coastal regions of, I forget what continent, but they live on the coast and they dive into the ocean. And I think they can stay down there for up to like 5 minutes, and they eat the algae on the rocks. But because the ocean is cold, I think it's the Atlantic, because the ocean is cold, they can't stay down there too long. And then they have to come up and then they sit on the rocks in the sun to warm up their body. Okay, so if you're cold or warm-blooded, if you're a conformer or a regulator, you can either acclimate or you can escape if the conditions are too harsh. Usually the escape is temporary. So short-term example is desert animals. They have options because the hottest time of the day is around noon or like early afternoon. So they can either hide underground during those times, and they can only come out at night. They can also hide under bushes and things like that. Or a little bit more of a long-term solution is dormancy. And you can see here the black bear is hibernating. She's had her babies. She's had her cubs in hibernation. And so this also takes some adaptation. So for the black bear, in the fall, when the temperature starts to decline, she's going to have to eat a lot because she has to build up her body fat, because she's going to go into hibernation. I think the polar bear, I'm not sure about black bears, but a polar bear hibernates for 5 months of the year. So imagine basically not eating for 5 months. So the bears, they hibernate. They have to basically gain twice as much body fat before they hibernate. And then the females, if they mate before they hibernate, they will become pregnant and they will give birth in hibernation. And they'll have to feed their cubs milk that is being converted from their body fat. So when she comes out of hibernation in the spring, she'll weigh half as much and she'll be very weak, and she's going to have to try to find food as soon as possible so that she can keep her strength. Otherwise, both she and her cubs will die. For animals that don't hibernate, there is another option called migration. Now, it's not just birds that migrate, butterflies also migrate. And this is basically temporarily going somewhere that's nicer, right? So the seasonal movements of birds in North America, like between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, you will have birds that migrate from Canada all the way down to either southern US or even Mexico during the winter time, and then they'll go back up to Canada in the spring. Hell, some humans even do this, right? You got some humans like, I have a friend who's basically decided to retire here now because she got stuck. She's from Canada. And for the last 5 years, she would come to Thailand during the wintertime because she doesn't like the cold. But this last time that she came, of course, COVID hit at the beginning of last year and she was stuck here. And so then she was like, screw it, I'm just going to retire here. Let's see, 9, 10, 10, I've got 10 minutes. Okay. The next topic are resources. Whether a species can survive in a particular habitat depends on the suitability of environmental conditions, but also on the availability of resources. Resources like energy, food, nesting sites, water, sunlight, any kind of abiotic factor can be a resource. It's just basically things that you need to survive. Of course, resources vary from species to species. We need a particular set of resources that, let's say, chinchooks don't need, right? Like we don't need flies because we don't eat them. So in the way of resources, we can look at an organism's niche. And a niche includes the resources of an organism. It includes the habitat. It's every part of the life of a species. It can include the tolerance range, the tolerance curve. It can include not only what kinds of resources that it needs, but how it gets those resources. For example, if you are a cheetah that lives in Africa, you have to hunt to get your food, but also because you also have 2 other species of large cats in Africa, you've got the lion and you've got the leopard. Not only do you need to hunt and have the skills to hunt, but you also have to be able to, what do you call that? Like defend your kill, because, and it's not just the other big cats, but it's also like hyenas. Hyenas are pretty mean. If you've ever seen Animal Planet, they go in packs and they're pretty vicious. Hyenas can take away a cheetah's kill because they're more powerful than the cheetah. A leopard can, a lion can. So each of those cats has a different ability to set itself apart from the other big cats. So for example, lions, of course, are the largest. They also travel in packs. Leopards are the only big cats that can climb trees. So as soon as a leopard makes a kill, it is going to find the nearest tree and it will drag its kill up the tree, because then the hyenas, the cheetahs, and the lions can't get it. And of course, the cheetah is just like the fastest. It also includes the number of offspring that it has. It also includes how often they have offspring and what time of year they have offspring, and all of their interactions between that species and its environment. So pretty much that's why I said like the way of life. Now, the niche can be broken down into two different niches. You've got fundamental, which means basic, and realized or real niche. So a fundamental niche is the range of conditions that a species can tolerate and the range of resources it can use, versus the realized niche is the range of conditions that a species does tolerate and the resources it does use. So a really good example of this would be if you think about, what can a human being eat? Can we eat cockroaches? Yes. Do we? No. So the cockroach would be part of our fundamental niche, but it would not be part of our realized niche, because we can eat it, but we don't in general, right? I'm sure there's some culture somewhere that eat cockroaches, and I'm sure you would probably do it if you were desperate enough. Another one, can we eat grass? Sure. Do we? No. So the fundamental niche is always larger. So I've got this graphic. The fundamental niche is the square that's in yellow. It's always larger than the realized niche, which is the smaller green circle. Now, based on the niche, we can divide organisms into two groups. The first group, they're called generalists. Speaking of the cockroach is a generalist, and the raccoon is a generalist. A generalist, as the name implies, general, they have a broad niche, so they can tolerate a lot of different conditions. They can eat a lot of different things. They can live a lot of different places, etc. I don't think we have raccoons here in Thailand, but I know in America, they're a really big problem because they have these cutesy little human kind of hands that are very dexterous, which means they're really good at using their hands to manipulate things. So in some places, when the raccoon population gets too high, people have to actually weigh down their garbage bin lids with like big rocks or something, because they can actually tip over the garbage can and like they eat our garbage. Same thing with cockroaches, obviously, the famous prediction that like humans could annihilate the earth with like nuclear weapons and cockroaches will still survive. So a variety of resources, a large range of conditions can be tolerated. Now the opposite of, oh no, here's a cute little GIF that I found to show you just how much of a generalist a raccoon is. So we've got the raccoon and you've got some cats over here. The raccoon's just gonna go in and be like, I'll have some of that, thank you, and runs away. See what I mean when they got these cute little hands that can like grab onto things? And all of the cats are just like, what the? So normally you wouldn't see a raccoon eating cat food in the wild, but they are also opportunists, right? Because they're generalists, they will use whatever resource is available. And if that raccoon smells the cat food, it's like, I can eat that, it's gonna go and take it. The opposite of a generalist is a specialist. And just even as a general English word, the word specialist, when you say that you are very specialized, I know it's using the same words, but you are focused in on a very narrow topic. So they have a narrow niche. So their tolerance curve is going to be much narrower, and the amount of resources that they use is going to be much smaller. Great examples of a specialist are the panda, which not only only eat bamboo, but they can also only eat young bamboo, which is tender. And of course, the koala, which only eats the leaves of the eucalyptus tree. Okay.